Every time I opened the refrigerator, I found myself saying the exact same words. Oh, there's nothing to eat. Strangely, a few minutes later, I was walking back home carrying bags full of groceries. Even so, the pantry at home was already so full it could barely close. I quietly started asking myself a different question. Were we really running out of food? Or did I simply not know what we already had? The answer to that question changed the way our family looked at our kitchen, our money, and what felt like enough. My name is Clara, and this is the story of the 10 days we decided to eat only from what was already in our pantry. The morning unfolded like it always did. I kept opening the refrigerator while making breakfast, yet I never really noticed what was already inside. A block of unopened cheese was still sitting on the top shelf. In the freezer, the chicken I had bought on sale 2 weeks earlier was still waiting. The pantry was already stocked with pasta, rice, beans, oatmeal, and canned soup. Even so, the same thought quietly returned. We should go grocery shopping. That afternoon, I opened the grocery shopping app again. My finger nearly pressed the checkout button before I had even made a list of what we actually needed. I paused when I noticed how much we had already spent on groceries this month. The number was higher than our budget, even though many older ingredients had never been used. That was the moment an uncomfortable thought settled in. Maybe the problem wasn't a lack of food, but how quickly we looked for the easiest answer whenever we didn't know what to cook. The next morning, I decided to open every shelf in the pantry one by one. I placed everything on the dining table so I could finally see it all at once. Only then did I notice what had been hiding in plain sight. 2 identical boxes of pasta, 3 cans of corn, and seasonings that were already close to their expiration dates sat together on the table. I felt a little embarrassed as I looked at everything. We had kept buying groceries, not because we needed them, but because I had forgotten what we already had. I opened the freezer next. Inside, there was still meat, frozen vegetables, and bread that could become several different meals. The longer I counted everything we had, the clearer the pattern became. Our home was not short on food. We had simply stopped noticing the supplies already there. That was when a slightly bold idea came to mind. What if we went for 10 days without buying any groceries at all? That night, after Mira had fallen asleep, I invited Armand to sit with me for a quiet conversation. I told him about my idea of trying a 10-day pantry challenge. Armand smiled as he looked at everything spread across the pantry supplies on the table. "It looks like we really don't need to buy groceries yet," he said. Together, we came up with one simple rule. We wouldn't buy any new groceries unless it was truly an emergency. Then I placed a small note on the refrigerator door. It simply said, "Check the pantry first." I didn't know whether the challenge would work, but for the first time, it felt like we were trying to change a habit instead of simply cutting expenses. Without realizing it, that small change was already beginning to shift the way I looked at our kitchen. Maybe we hadn't needed more groceries all along. Maybe we only needed to notice what we already had. The first day felt much easier than I had expected. I turned leftover rice, eggs, and vegetables that had nearly been forgotten in the refrigerator into a simple fried rice. The second day asked for a little more patience. I stood in front of the pantry for several quiet minutes, trying to build a meal from ingredients I rarely use together. Every now and then, I felt the urge to drive to the supermarket. Buying something new seemed much easier than spending more time thinking in the kitchen. Outside our little experiment, life kept moving as usual. Armand went to work, Mira left for school, and our home stayed filled with small moments of laughter between everyday routines. Inside my mind, though, a quiet struggle continued. I was beginning to notice that shopping was not only about food, but also about reaching for comfort in the quickest way. Each time I resisted the urge to shop, a quiet sense of pride settled in. It wasn't about saving money, but about making our choices a little more consciously. By the 5th day, dinner looked much simpler than it usually did. A pot of potato soup, toasted bread, and the last of the vegetables quietly filled the table. For a moment, I worried that Mira might complain. I was afraid she would feel that we were taking away a little of her happiness. After her first bite, Mira smiled instead. She quietly said, "Mom, you're really good at making delicious food from what we already have." Her simple words left me silent for a few seconds. I realized that my daughter was noticing how we enjoyed what we already had together, not how much we bought. That night, I looked at the pantry as it slowly became more organized. Shelves that had once been crowded were finally beginning to open up, without food going to waste. In that quiet moment, I felt something I could hardly explain. For so long, I had searched for the feeling of enough by buying more, even though it seemed to grow while we appreciated what we already had. That evening, after the kitchen was clean again, I sat alone looking through my old grocery lists. It was the first time I noticed a pattern that had quietly escaped my attention. I realized I often shopped before our supplies were actually gone. It simply felt easier than stopping long enough to see what we already had. Every trip to the supermarket had always felt like the answer. Yet many times, what we needed had already been waiting in our pantry, refrigerator, or freezer. From that evening on, I began one small habit before writing any shopping list. I checked the pantry, the refrigerator, and the freezer first. I started calling it the pantry first rule. We used what was already there before buying only what was still needed. That simple rule quietly changed the way we looked at both food and money. I finally understood that we were not running out of groceries. We had simply stopped noticing what was already enough. On the 10th night, Armand and I sat together and reviewed our grocery spending for the month. The total was much lower than either of us had expected. Armand smiled softly before speaking in a quiet voice. It turns out we weren't living with less. We were simply living with more awareness. I nodded quietly as I closed the budget notebook. What made me happiest was not the money we had saved, but the new habit beginning to take shape. We also realized that almost no food had been wasted during those 10 days. Every ingredient had finally been given a chance to be used. That conversation felt calm from beginning to end. There was no blaming each other for old habits, only quiet gratitude that we had learned together. I realized that the biggest change in our home had not started with buying less. It had begun with our willingness to notice what we already had. After the challenge ended, I stopped writing a shopping list the moment I thought about groceries. I always walked to the pantry first before reaching for my wallet. Little by little, our kitchen shelves became more organized. Not because there was less inside them, but because everything was actually being used. I no longer felt anxious when our supplies started running low. I knew how to build meals from what was already waiting at home. Our grocery spending became calmer and more intentional. Somehow, we also found ourselves cooking together more often than before. I realized that creativity often appeared when our choices were limited. Gratitude quietly grew when I stopped looking for something new all the time. Those 10 days did not turn us into a perfect family. They simply changed the way we looked at food, money, and what felt like enough. Today, I believe we often already have more than we think. Sometimes all we need is the willingness to look at what is already there before buying more. If you ever feel like your home has nothing left to cook, pause for a moment. Take another look at your pantry, refrigerator, and freezer before heading to the store. If this little story from my family journal stayed with you today, I'd be happy to have you join us at Clara's Family Journal. There are still many simple stories about family, money, and everyday life that I'd love to share. Now, I'd like to ask you something. What ingredient has been sitting in your pantry for months that you'd finally like to cook this week?